Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me. The interaction from yesterday's video is absolutely amazing, and bless you guys for that. I appreciate it. So today, after many comments that have made it obvious this is the direction you guys want me to take things, we're going to reopen the investigation into Tartaria. Alright? And in order to do so, we're going to go back to the very beginning of where this culture originates from. And in order to do so, we have to head back to the book of Genesis, and we have to start discussing Nimrod, his kingdom, and the Tower of Babel. Now, according to ancient literature, Nimrod was the first one world order government, the leader. He established all of the cultures of the world into one nation. They all spoke a common language and came together on the plains of Shinar in order to build a structure known as the Tower of Babel that measured between 100 miles squared and 200 miles squared at its foundation, and before it was destroyed, towered at over 8,148 feet tall. Now, we have to start talking about Nimrod as a historical figure in order for this story to progress forward. According to ancient literature and the way that the Hebrews translated the original texts tells us very clearly that Nimrod at some point partook in some sort of ritual that made him start transforming into a man of great stature, aka a giant. And according to the text, this was more than likely done through some sort of sexual ritual. That's not important. However, you have to look at the time period and the stories that are being told around this time period. Giants are very common. You see David and his men of renown going around and fighting and killing giants on a regular basis, okay? Nimrod himself partook in a ritual that turned him into a giant. Now, everybody may think this is absolutely crazy to be talking about out loud. However, there are historical records of skeletons being found of humanoid people that measure over 15 feet tall. And in fact, in the 1800s, early 1900s, there was 13-foot skeletons found less than a mile and a half away from my mom's house. So there is historical and physical evidence to back up the fact that giants did roam this earth. And you have no further to look than Genesis itself as far as seeing giants being mentioned in the Bible, as far as the Nephilim, etc., etc. So Nimrod managed to pull the entire world under one banner with one common language. Now, the technology and the wisdom and the intelligence and the fortitude of the people to be able to come together and accomplish this would have had to have been beyond what us as modern humans can imagine. Think about this logically for a moment. Do we have the technology today to build a structure that's 100 miles squared, okay, and over 8,000 feet tall? And apparently, according to texts, it took over a year to traverse your way to the top of this structure. To the point where when they were bringing bricks up to the top of this structure, if a brick fell to the ground, they would mourn the loss of that brick. However, if a man fell to the ground and died during the construction, they didn't care at all. That's the kind of labor and passion that they had for this structure. But not only that, it also goes to show you where their mindset was, both morally and as far as their ambition, their ego, their conceitedness. Now, according to Genesis, God, once he saw this structure starting to take place and take shape, came down to the plains of Shinar himself and looked at this structure and said, everything that these people are trying to do, nothing will be restrained from them if they are allowed to accomplish this task. And according to the text and legend, there were 3 different factions of people that were sitting there on the plains of Shinar, guilds if you will. Now one of them's goal was to ascend to the throne of God, dethrone God, and insert their own gods into the equation in his place. Okay? Another group was to go up and to kill God himself. Okay? And the third group was to go up with bows and spears and wage war against God's warriors, his army. These people clearly wanted to use the Tower of Babel to ascend to the throne of God and overthrow his majesty and reinsert Nimrod in his place. Okay. Now something that you have to realize is these people, A, had the ability to come together with a common desire to dethrone God, and B, God acknowledges himself in the Bible that everything that they are trying to accomplish is possible. Now, in order to prevent this from happening, God decides that he's going to smite the Tower of Babel, destroying it. And on top of that, he's going to separate this one world order into different tribes of people, destroying their common language and giving several to the people so they cannot communicate with each other and operate as one nation anymore. Okay? Now there's a lot of theories as to how many languages there are, but that's irrelevant. The point here is, once this takes place and construction on this tower is stopped, how do you get, they say there was 600,000 men working on this structure at its peak. How do you get 600,000 men that are speaking 70 different languages to work together and accomplish a task? They can't understand each other. They don't have the ability or fortitude to learn a new language. Like, there's 70 of them. How are you ever going to do this? Ultimately, they end up leaving the plains of Shinar and spreading out throughout the rest of the world. Now, this is where Tartarian culture, in my opinion, begins. According to the scriptures, the original language, in my opinion, just based on my observations, the original language that they were speaking before God came down and separated this culture into different languages, I believe it was Hebrew. Okay? And I also believe Abraham, who was historically around at this time, was entrusted with keeping that original language of Hebrew intact. Okay? And that explains a lot as far as Hebrew being the root of all translation when it comes to the Bible. It always has been, it always will be. In fact, if you look at babies when they are born, if you do research on the sounds that babies are making, there's a strong inclination to believe that they're actually speaking Paleo-Hebrew, which may very well be this original language that was used in Shinar, the one that Abraham himself preserved. Okay, but let's think about this for a moment. So these languages are all separated now, and they all had one king before, Nimrod. However, say you have 70 different languages, they are all going to be referring to Nimrod as a different name. And this is interesting because historically, you see the same mythologies, the same stories, everything that happened pre-Tower of Babel starts popping up in different languages with different annotations, with different character names. However, the characteristics of these protagonists in the stories always happen to be the same. Look at Mithra, for example. perfect example of Nimrod. If you look at Mithra's life and Nimrod's life and you put them side by side and you look at the mythology, they are definitely the same exact person. Okay. Now let's just think for a moment. Why would God entrust just one person, Abraham, okay, with holding on to Paleo-Hebrew and passing it on and still having the knowledge of everything that took place? I would assume, like the other tribes that were separated into different tribes and languages, there's going to be more than one person, Abraham, you have his family and everybody else, etc., that he's familiar with, his close-knit group of people are going to be able to speak that older language amongst themselves, but not only that, they're going to be able to have a firmer grasp of the history that took place prior to the Tower of Babel. Because think about this. If there was a written language, which you assume there would have had to have been to devise the architecture of that tower, Abraham and his people are going to be the only ones that are able to read and understand that language, giving meaning to everything that took place before, aka the Watchers. Now, after the Tower of Babel falls and these groups are separated, you start seeing commonalities all over the world, culturally, architecturally, spiritually, ceremonially, holiday-wise, their beliefs, their ideas, everything that they have seen, it all seems to have a common thread that ties back to the Tower of Babel. Okay? As far as the maps that were drawn, we have full-scale flat Earth maps that show us every single continent, including Antarctica, from right around the same time period, developing out of China. Okay? And like I said, the entire purpose of the Tower of Babel was ascend to the throne of God and overthrow him. The only way that this is feasibly possible is on a flat Earth. We're just going to leave that there for a moment because I believe that that's a strong component of Tartarian culture and understanding that society and civilization to begin with. Now, another thing that's very interesting is if you start looking at Tartarian culture and how it's all over the world, wouldn't it make a whole lot of sense that certain traditions, certain beliefs, certain cultural practices are going to find their way into these new tribes, these new cultures? And this is why we see similarities with calendar structures, with holiday structures, with the architecture, and very much so the technology that happens to show up all over the world at the same time with apparently absolutely no influence, right? So, for example, we have the Great Pyramids, okay? And if you look at those pyramids geometrically, they happen to be identical to the geometric foundations of the pyramids in the Yucatan, the pyramids down in South America, the pyramids in China, the pyramids in Siberia. They all have the same geometry. And now for a long time, people postulated that there was actually travel between these cultures and that these cultures interacted with each other. But that goes against everything we were told with the Tower of Babel, because that whole purpose of separating those tribes is so they didn't have communication with each other. However, your mathematics, if they all tie back to the same process and origin, are all going to be the same. Now, the geometry is identical, but the way that these pyramids are constructed aren't. For example, there's step pyramids in Mexico. The pyramids that are over in China look nothing like the pyramids that are over in Egypt, etc., etc. So, you have to explain that. If these people were traversing back and forth and had communication with each other, why isn't their architecture identical? Okay? Now, the only logical explanation for me is that these people weren't communicating directly with each other, but rather the origins of their history derived from the same exact place. Okay? And if you start looking at a lot of these megalithic structures that these cultures created, they revolve around frequency resonance and electromagnetism. Now, think for a moment. We wouldn't be able to build the Tower of Babel with all the technology that we have today, no matter how hard we tried. It would be absolutely impossible. Not only because the technology itself isn't capable of doing it, but because even as culturally developed as we are, even with the ambition and the ego and the greed that we have driving us, we have nothing that would solidify us as a core group of people to actually make us build a tower like this. We don't have the ambition, we don't have the drive, we don't have the want or the cohesion to do so. And that was done by design. Yesterday, I mentioned very briefly that there's no coincidence the more and more the world starts speaking a common language like English or Mandarin. The more and more people that speak the same language, the more and more this world seems to be moving towards chaos. And that's identical to what happened with the Tower of Babel. Now, if you notice, the reason that Tartar thrived so well is because even though there was different federations, right? There was one federation, right? The Tartarian Federation, correct? According to our beliefs. However, there was pockets of culture, there was pockets of language, there was different nation states inside of this federation, this group of people that worked together. They had the best of both worlds going for them. Okay? Now, eventually, you see a quickening where, once again, everything is reset and we begin the process all over again. Because if you look at the rise and fall of Tartar civilization, you can clearly see it started out as a homogenized group of diverse tribes that the more and more they came together and became one, the more and more things descended into chaos, and the more and more they couldn't control the outcome of their civilization. It's almost as though the more and more people lose their tribal identity, the more and more susceptible they are to falling victim to the ensnarement and the lure of grandeur and power. It's the same cycle we see repeated over and over again. Now, moving forward, I'm going to start discussing the technology, okay? How this tower was originally constructed and how that technology probably influenced Tartarian culture as far as the electromagnetic electricity that they were drawing out of the air with Tesla technology, etc., etc. And just for a little taste of that video, think for a moment. Like I said, we wouldn't be able to build the Tower of Babel with all of our technology today. How did they do it back then? How did they move massive stones that were hundreds of feet long by 100 feet wide, 8,000 feet into the air? You're not doing that with a crane. So how did they do it? And if you want to get a head start on the homework for that video, go check out a structure known as the Coral Castle in Florida that was supposedly constructed by one man with nothing more than a tripod set up with wood and crystals. And I shit you not, this structure is amazing to the point where he has coral that weighs over 2 tons pivoting on itself by the push of a finger. Absolutely amazing. That's where I leave you guys today. You can reach me through Twitter at Morlog Morning Digest. You can email me at morlog89@gmail.com. You can find my PayPal at paypal.me/morelogmorningdigest. Take care of yourselves. God bless you and your families. That's all you really have.